Same thing happens if we talk about a low price. So at $3, if we force the price down to $3, now the consumers are really happy. Potentially, right? They've got a whole lot more, right? But either the businesses are going to produce less and there's going to be a loss, or the business is going to be dumb and produce more and lose. Either way, the businesses are going to be worse off, the consumers are going to be better off, but we're going to suffer again another deadweight loss. 5 is the only place where Pareto is having his day. Any other price, we can make somebody better off without making anybody else worse off, which means 5 is a better price than that point. Okay? 5 is the optimal. All this goes back to our buddy Adam Smith. Remember Adam Smith reminding us that trades are voluntary. We're exchanging money for that sandwich, and the store is exchanging the sandwich for money. Nobody's making us. We're doing it because we want to. You don't do things, hopefully, you don't do things that make you worse off. You only do things that make you better off. You gave them that money and took that sandwich because you're happier with the sandwich than you were with the money. Trades are voluntary. Sometimes markets not work right. And economists call this market failure because we're like really creative. There's lots of sources of market failure, and we're going to talk about some of them. Okay? Market failure is witnessed by either overproduction or underproduction. How do we know the market's not working right? Well, it's producing too much or it's producing not enough. And underproduction always comes with a deadweight loss. Okay? We're either going to produce too much of something or produce too little of something. And that's an example of market failure if those occur. Overproduction or underproduction is a sign of market failure. So the most common kind of market failure we get, at least that we use as examples in the real world, is price and quantity regulation. So sometimes the government passes laws that affect the price. And most of the time those laws are in the form of a price ceiling or a price floor. A price ceiling is a maximum price. A price floor is a minimum price. So we think about minimum wage, which is a price floor. You can't pay someone $2 an hour. You have to pay them at least the minimum wage. When Queen Elizabeth was around, she didn't think too much of workers. She actually had maximum wage laws in England to prevent people from making too much money, the workers, the peasants. Okay? That's a price ceiling. Some cities in the United States, like New York and San Francisco, and now basically the entire state of California, have price ceilings on rents. Okay? It's very expensive to live in San Francisco. It's very expensive to live in New York. So the government has an interest in making sure that people who work in those cities can afford to live in those cities. So one thing they do is they put ceilings on rents. So the rent can't be higher than $3. Well, what effect does that have? Everything always has a consequence. In economics, nothing is free. There are always trade-offs. If 10 years from now you don't remember anything else from this class, remember that nothing is ever free. There are always trade-offs. If you're in the business of building apartments and the government says you can only charge $3 in rent, how interested are you in building apartments? Well, the answer is you're not. Okay? California, by their own measure, is short maybe 1 million housing units. 1 million. Why? Because the rents, well, One reason is that the rents in a lot of places aren't high enough. Even though California has these spectacularly high rents, in some places like San Francisco where there's rent control, the rents aren't high enough to get people to build new apartments. So the people who would live in apartments in San Francisco have to live in the surrounding areas that didn't have rent control, and that drives up the rents in the places that don't have rent control. Okay? Then in California and everywhere else in the world, there's the whole not in my neighborhood thing. So everybody wants the apartments built in some other town, and towns all over California made it really hard for people to build apartments. And that means that there's fewer and fewer apartments in California, and rents go up and up and up. Okay? The minimum wage, when we say, hey, the minimum wage is $7 an hour, and during a recession, maybe the equilibrium wage is actually $5 an hour. But we think that people can't live. They can't live on $7 an hour. They certainly can't live on $5 an hour. So we've been pushing the minimum wage up, right? Increasing the minimum wage. Well, what effect should that have in the labor market? The higher that minimum wage goes, the more people want to work, but the fewer people businesses want to hire. Now the evidence, the actual real world evidence, so the graph says there should be unemployment. That's not what we see. The actual evidence is two things. One, that businesses might cut hours. So you need a certain number of people to work, but maybe you give them fewer hours. Or two, you're more likely to want experienced people. The higher the wages, the more businesses try to hire experienced workers, and the harder it is for inexperienced workers to find jobs. So it has effects in the labor market. Supply and demand are not meeting. Okay? And we may have social reasons why we want to do this and why we think this is a good thing, why we should pay people $12 or $15 an hour so they can actually buy food and pay rent and live. But at the same time, we know that nothing is free and there are going to be consequences. Okay? So where we have price floors or price ceilings, or the government can also affect the quantity. The government buys up bunches of oranges every year and destroys them. It buys up food, buys up milk and destroys it every year to get the price to go up. Okay? So rather than saying the price of milk has to be at least X, they go buy a whole bunch of milk and take it off the market. So they decrease the supply of milk or increase the demand. You can think about it kind of either way. The government's in there affecting the milk market to change the price. So the market's not going to be efficient because the milk producers are producing too much milk and the government's buying it up. Taxes and subsidies are kind of the same thing here. Let's suppose that here's our product and the government puts a sandwich tax on. So the government says, listen, every time you sell a sandwich, you have to add this tax. Well, what's that tax going to do to the store? Well, everything else being equal, if we leave the price at $5 and we add a tax, the profits of the store are going to go down. Well, as the profits of the store go down, that store is less willing to supply the product, and the tax is going to move the supply curve to the left. Okay, hopefully we've all practiced this a bunch of times from our previous chapter. Supply curve moves to the left. It's going to force the price of the business up. And just like before, we're going to generate these little triangles here, and we're going to have a deadweight loss. The tax creates a deadweight loss in the market for sandwiches. Now, some economists go, oh, see, taxes are always bad. Well, you don't know. The thing that lives in this world, remember we talked about normative and positive value judgments. Can we actually make a value judgment? The store here and the consumer of the sandwiches, they're worse off. There's no question. But what did the government use that tax money for? If it made another group of people really happy by doing something with that tax money, society might be happier because the people who got the money that we took away in this tax are compensating for the people who are unhappy because we taxed them, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But clearly that tax creates a deadweight loss in this market and makes the consumers and the producers of these sandwiches worse off. Okay. Sometimes we have market failure because of what we call common property and public goods. So those are two different kinds of goods, and we'll talk about them in more detail later on. But there are things that we don't own individually, but we own as a group. The fish in a lake or a stream or an ocean. We don't individually own each fish. There's no little marker on there that says, hey, this is Bill's fish. Whoever catches that fish owns the fish. They're common property. Okay? We stop Russian fishing boats from coming over and fishing off of Alaska because those are American fish. But they don't belong to any specific American. They belong to whoever American goes out and gets them. The problem with these things, of course, is that since everybody owns them, everybody might go try and fish them. So there used to be salmon in basically every river in the United States. There's salmon left in 5. Okay? We overfish. All over the coast of Africa and Southeast Asia, there are fishing villages where there are no fish left, where they've overfished them until the point that there's no fish. In Chesapeake Bay off of Baltimore, there used to be a whole bunch of kinds of fish that just aren't there anymore either because they overfished them until they went away. Okay? Number whatever we're up to, externalities. An externality occurs, and again, we're going to talk about these all semester long. An externality means that there was a transaction between people and somebody else either paid a cost because of that transaction or got a benefit because of that transaction. So you live downstream from a factory. The factory's producing cars. The factory's making money off of selling the cars. The consumers who buy those cars are getting the benefit of owning the car, but the river's polluted. And the people downstream are paying a cost from the polluted river that is not part of the transaction, right? The factory and the people who buy the products of the factory, they should pay the cost of producing the cars. But because the factory can dump this stuff in the river, other people are paying part of the cost. This happens in mines all the time. Go up into the Rockies and look at old gold mines and silver mines and lead mines and whatever. They would divert rivers 150 years ago, divert a creek into the mine, so there's water in the mine, put a little dam, divert it. The water goes through the mine, comes out the other side. When it comes out the other side, it's toxic water. It's poisonous water. Now, 150 years later, that mine is gone. The people who took the gold out of that mine took that gold and at least temporarily went off and got rich and did whatever with it. But today, even today, the people downstream are drinking the lead or drinking the gold. They're paying the price. They're paying a cost for that mine's existence. Okay? That's an externality. In this case, we produce too much. That gold mine should have paid the cost of producing the gold. Instead, it passed those costs on to other people, and it made more profit than it should have, which means it mined more stuff than they should have. Okay? Now, externalities can also be positive. If you buy a house and then the school district comes along and builds an elementary school down the street from your house, the value of your house will go up. You didn't have to pay for that elementary school, but your house is now worth more because young families like to live near elementary schools. Okay? If the county builds a park across the street from your house, the value of your house will go up. People like to live near parks. Okay? So we don't have the point of this, remember, underproduction and overproduction. We produce too much of some goods because those goods are creating pollution, but we're not making them pay to clean up the pollution. So the prices of those goods are too low, and we're producing too much of them. We don't produce enough parks. And the reason we don't produce enough parks is we don't make everybody who benefits from that park pay for the benefit. If everybody who lived near a park paid some money into a pool because they benefited from the park, we could build more parks. Okay, monopoly. Now, it's not just about monopoly. It's about any lack of competition. We need competition for that market to work right. It's a competitive market. We need competition for the market to work right. What would the power company in Las Vegas charge you in the summer for electricity if they could? Well, the answer is they charge you a really, really high price. Okay? And the reason they don't is because the government comes in and doesn't let them, but because there's no competition in the market for electricity, right? The price would be wrong, really wrong, if the government didn't do something about it. And you say, well, solar. Yeah. If you hook solar up to the grid, you have to pay a fee to NV Energy to do it. Okay? It's what happens when you have a monopoly. All right? High transaction costs. If your favorite restaurant is in San Francisco and you live in Las Vegas, why don't you go to that restaurant all the time? Well, the answer is there's a cost associated with making that transaction, which is going to San Francisco. Even if your favorite Chinese restaurant in Las Vegas is on the other side of town, you probably don't go there all the time. And the reason is you have to drive, it costs you money and time, and it's a pain. And so a lot of times you just go around the corner and get lesser Chinese food because there's less transaction cost for you to have to pay. Okay? The theory of supply and demand assumes that the cost of actually making the transaction is zero. Okay? Well, we know that all transactions do not have zero cost. Sometimes you have to hire a lawyer. Sometimes you have to get in your car and drive. Sometimes it takes an hour of your time. Those transaction costs can affect what you do and affect how the market works. Okay? And again, something that we'll talk about as time goes on. And then the whole problem of information and biases. You might not actually know what your favorite Chinese restaurant in Vegas is because you haven't been to all of them. And if you went to a whole bunch more restaurants, you might discover there's one you like way more than the one you think you like the most. Right? And it turns out that people have biases. They have these innate biases in them, and we'll talk about this more, but people don't operate necessarily all the time the way the market needs them to work for that market to work correctly. All right? And we'll be back to that.